Kiddushin Daf Samach Amud Aleph and Beis. Perception and reality. Hודאת כמאה, עדים דמי. We're in this very difficult phase at the moment between the shock of what has happened and the concern and worry about what's about to happen. It's a hard time for everyone. We need to be mechazek one another, we need to mechazek ourselves, and may our learning and the learning of everybody in Eretz Yisrael, in Klal Yisrael, so much limud Torah is taking place and so much chesed. May all the limud Torah and all the chesed be a zchut to protect Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael from our enemies as we go ahead to secure our futures, that our soldiers and the country should be protected. A woman came up to me after shul on Shabbos and says that this time she's needed a lot of chizuk, and so she listens to the various things that I've put out, but she thought she would try the Matmonim, although she has no background in this at all, and she thought it would be way over her head. And she was just so amazed that she got such a lot out of it. And again, it's a word to those people who are not that technically advanced. We're doing a complicated piece of Gemara today, but you'll find it fascinating and you'll find it illuminating, and of course there's always the precious matmon that we get out of it. The issue that we're going to be dealing with conceptually is the issue about perceptions and reality. My view of the truth, my view of reality, and an objective view of reality. From a more technical perspective, what we're looking at is the din of needing Adim for Kiddushin. So you've got to have two witnesses at a wedding, as we know, and they're a very important part of the Kiddushin. What happens if two people get married and there are no Adim? And they both agree they got married, and everybody agrees. Everybody knows they got married. There's no question about that. But there are no proper witnesses. There are no edim. What is the status of that marriage? Now you'll remember back in the beginning of Gittin, we talked about two different kinds of edut: the edus raya and the edus raya and the edus kiyum. Sometimes witnesses are used to provide evidence to substantiate an event, and sometimes it's lekayim, it's to give authority to an event. And we talked about Gittin and about Kiddushin in that light. Today we realize in our sugya that the need for witnesses in Kiddushin is closely linked to the need for witnesses in monetary matters. So you can't just say, well, in Kiddushin you need witnesses because it's Eidei Kiyum. They validate the event, whereas in monetary matters they simply give credence to the event. That we can't really say because we see the linkage. So we've got a Rambam in Hilchos Ishus where the Rambam says, based on our Gemara, "Hamakadesh be'ed echad ein choshishin likidushav." If a person used only one witness at the wedding is not valid. Even if they both agree that there's no question, nobody's arguing about whether there was a wedding or not, there just weren't witnesses. Kal v'chomer mekadesh b'lo edim, and certainly if there are no witnesses at all, wedding's not valid. On the other hand, Zeh HaKinyan, the Rambam says in Hilchos Mechira, these laws of Kinyan, ein tzarich liot bifnei edim. When you're making a Kinyan, you don't need witnesses. So in the laws of monetary matters, you don't need witnesses for a Kinyan, for an acquisition. The only reason you need Kinyanim is in case there's a dispute afterwards, so the witnesses can settle the dispute. But if there's no dispute, you don't need witnesses. But in Kiddushin, you do. And yet the very need for witnesses in Kiddushin is learned from Mamonot. Because we've got when it comes to the laws of Mamonot, in Parsha Shoftim, we have Al Pi Shnei Eidim or Al Pi Shlosha Eidim Yakum Davar. The verse that I quote at the beginning of the source sheet. And we've learned that before, that matters are established in matters of monetary issues through two witnesses. And that same word davar appears in the posuk we've been using all the way through Gittin and through Kiddushin, that one posuk. Ki yikach ish isho v'alav v'yayim lo timtzachin be'enav ki mitzah ba'ervat davar, the laws of marriage and divorce in the same posuk. And the word ervat davar is there. And the Gemara learns from the fact that there's a davar, a gzera shava. Davar is used seemingly unnecessary in the marriage posuk, and it's used seemingly unnecessarily in the monetary posuk. And we learn from there, davar, that just as you need witnesses in monetary matters, you need witnesses at a wedding. So you see that the nature of the witnesses is the same, and yet in monetary matters we say if everybody agrees, you don't need witnesses. And in a Kiddushin we say even if everybody agrees, you need witnesses. So in what ways, how do we learn the one from the other, and yet they're not learned one from the other? It's all revolves around our Gemara. The Gemara says on Amud Aleph, Omer Rav Nachman Omer Shmuel HaMekadesh be'ed echad ein choshishin lekidushav va'afilu shneim modim. That's the source for the Rambam. That if there's only one witness, and certainly if there's no witness, even if everybody agrees the wedding took place, but there are no witnesses, there's no kiddushin. She doesn't need a get, she doesn't need anything. That's not a marriage. The Gemara goes backwards and forwards, and then says on the second page, "My havala." So what's the din? Rav Kahana Amar. This is one of these wonderful mornings where we're looking at psukim in the Torah from over 3,000 years ago. We're looking at a Gemara from nearly 2,000 years ago. We're looking at a Rambam from 3,000 years, 2,000 years, 1,000 years. Then we've got Tosfos, and then we've got a Reb Shimon Shkop from the 20th century. That's the scale of what we're going through, what we're living through, and understanding what Torah is. It's just unbelievable. So the Gemara says, so here we have Rav Kahana and Rav Papa in our Beis HaMedrash this morning. Rav Kahana says, Ein choshishin l'kiddushav, Rav Papa amar choshishin l'kiddushav. They argue as to whether kiddushin is valid if everybody agrees it took place, but there were no witnesses. So Rav Ashi says to Rav Kahani, clearly you learn from davar. The reason you think that you need witnesses is because we learn it from mandatory matters, davar, but you need witnesses for kiddushin. But in mandatory matters, if everybody agrees, you don't need the witnesses. You only need the witnesses if there's an argument. Why do you need witnesses for a wedding no matter what? If there weren't witnesses but nobody's arguing, who cares? Why is it not a good wedding? There's a difference. In mandatory matters, if everybody agrees, who are the interested parties? Who are the stakeholders? The claimant and the defendant. He says a loan took place, he says a loan didn't take place. In this case, they both agree a loan took place. So the stakeholders all agree. So why do you need witnesses? But in Kiddushin, there's a chav lachrini, there are other stakeholders. You'll remember we learned in Reb Shimon Shkop that the essence of a wedding is that the first thing is what you're doing is the man is forbidding her to everybody else. Consequently, she's permitted to him. But what Kiddushin really does is makes her asur like hekdesh, makes her asur to everybody else. So in a case of Kiddushin, it doesn't help that the two of them agree. The rest of society is also affected. The two of them agree that she's married. That means nobody else can marry her. So you can't this is where we come to perception. We both agree. Our reality is a wedding took place. We're not arguing about the fact that a wedding took place. And there were 100 people at the wedding, and they know that the wedding took place. They just weren't witnesses. They were at the reception. They weren't at the chuppah, but they know there was a wedding. Okay, that's your perception. That's great. If you were the only people involved, your perception would be fine. So this whole thing of when people say perception is, your perception is your reality. Yes, that's only provided your perception and your reality doesn't impact others. But if your perception and your reality does impact others, your perception is not enough. We need to know more than your perception. And therefore, says the Gemara, here it's chav la'achrina. Then there's a case of Rav Zutra and Rav Ada Saba were dividing property. They came before Rav Ashi, and they said, we don't have witnesses. Can we still change our minds, or we can't? We both agree with the facts. There's not an argument about what happens. And he says, Lo ivrus hadi ela l'shakri, an important phrase. Witnesses are there for liars. That's why you need witnesses, because sometimes one side lies, so we've got to have facts. But if nobody's lying, you both agree, you don't need witnesses. So this is the balance that we've got. On the one hand, you've got in mandatory matters lo ivri sadi ela l'shakri, and therefore hodat baldin kemea cumulative dami. If the person affected says, "I agree, I owe him the money," well, that's fine, that's done. We don't need witnesses, and you can't change your mind afterwards. But in Kiddushin, it doesn't work that way. Even if everybody agrees that the marriage took place, that's not sufficient. You need Eidim. And Tosfos, the famous Tosfos on Rabbeinu Tam on our Daf, here says, Mikan Omer Rabbeinu Tam, de'ein tzarich Eidim la'asot kinyan. You don't need Eidim for a kinyan. It's only for Kiddushin that you need a kinyan. You'll see a long set of sources on the next page. Don't be intimidated by them, although those who have the ability should definitely learn through this Rashbo and the Reb Shimon Shkop. What the Rashbo brings around, the Rashbo asks a fascinating question, and he says, Akati kashli mi mechayvet ike demai itla ala umay shaychi ba'denei meshi chavalahem bodata. Why are you saying that marriage affects other stakeholders? So they agree they're married. Yeah, but what about the rest of the world? Well, that means no other man can now marry her. So you've made her forbidden to every other man. You can't just do that by your own admission. You need Eidim for that. Says the Rashba, so then if I say I sold him the field, I admit to selling him the field, I've now made the field not available to anybody else. Is that called Chavla Achri? What's going on? The Rashba, a wonderful Rashba that he analyzes it, and he says, וישנו דגבי ממון דאילב דכתב רחמנה שיאמר כי הוא זה דמיני גמרינן הודאת בעל דין כמאה עדים דמי הווה אמינא דלעולם לא מקיימין מילתא אלא בסהדי. I would have thought, were it not from the posuk in Parashas Mishpatim, that say, from which we learn that a person's admission is binding, if it weren't for that actual verse, I would have thought you always need witnesses for a kinyan, just as you do for Kiddushin. And then he goes on and he says, then this posuk comes and says, no, if everybody is agreeable, you don't need witnesses. However, that's only where you're not impacting other people. Where you are impacting other people, it doesn't apply. And therefore, by Kiddushin, since davar, we link Kiddushin to monetary matters, what that means is, in Kiddushin, there is an element of Chavla Achrini, there is an element of causing negative impact to other people, and therefore it's compared to monetary matters where there is negative impact. And we know where there is negative impact to others in monetary matters, you need witnesses, right? So in Kiddushin, you need witnesses, says the Rashba. Very briefly and difficult to understand. Reb Shimon Shkop goes through a beautiful analysis. It starts off with the obvious question. It's so obvious that people don't even ask it. We established that by Kiddushin, you've got to have witnesses. No witnesses, no Kiddushin. And I haven't found a good explanation on this. And he goes into with the various questions and why it doesn't make sense. And he comes out with this amazing yesod, which is foundational in Reb Shimon Shkop, but it's based on this Rashba, which he quotes at the end. And that is that witnesses have two functions. Witnesses inform us as to what happens. They give us information, but they also empower a Beis Din. Al pishnayim edim yakum davar means, and we touched on this a couple of days ago, that the Beis Din creates a reality from now on. So on the one hand, the Eidim do some clarification about what actually happened. But even where they don't do that, what their real function is, Yakum Dover, they give the Beis Din, they give the court the power to decide the law and impose the law. To create that reality that from now on, irrespective of what's happened, from now on, you owe Reuven, you owe Chaim $1,000. And Reuven says, but I've never met Chaim. It doesn't matter. We've had the case, we've listened to witnesses. Right now, you owe Chaim $1,000, and we will force you to pay Chaim $1,000. That power the Beis Din gets from the witnesses. The Beis Din doesn't get it from the legislature. The Beis Din doesn't get it from Congress or from the Knesset. The Beis Din gets that power from the witnesses. The witnesses, the Torah tells us, the witnesses give the Beis Din the power to create that reality and impose it upon people. And what about, Reb Shimon Shkop explains, when they agree? So Hodat Bal Din Kemea Edim Dami. So what happens now? A man comes along and says, I agree. I owe Chaim $1,000. Beis Din says, fine, we don't need witnesses then. And a week later, Chaim comes back to Beis Din and he says he's refusing to pay the $1,000, which in front of you said he owes me. We'll force him to pay. So Reuven says, but there were no witnesses. Chaim can't bring proof that. But you admitted to it. Yes, I admitted to it, but the Torah says, Al pishnayim edim yokum dava. Yes, but we learn from Ki Huzeh that once you admit to something, it's binding, provided you're not impacting another person negatively. If you're not impacting anybody else, it's just between the two of you, then your admission is kemea edim. You also give Beis Din that same power. Just as witnesses give Beis Din the power, the Torah teaches us from these psukim. This whole piece is based on the 3 psukim that I bring in the beginning of the sources. From these psukim, we learn that your admission gave Beis Din that same power. So it doesn't matter anymore if there's evidence or there isn't evidence, or you did borrow or you didn't borrow. The fact that in front of us you admitted that you owe him $1,000, from now on you owe him $1,000 and Beis Din will enforce that. That's the power your admission gave to Beis Din. And what we see over here is this difference between a person's perception. So a person comes on and says, we agree. We agree that Reuven says, yeah, I agree. I owe him $1,000. Are there any witnesses? No, nobody was there. Does anybody in the world know this? No, nobody knows it. Could you bring proof that you owe him $1,000? No ways I could bring proof, but I admit to it. That becomes a reality. We don't look for any more proof. If you're certain about something, you don't need proof. If you're certain about something, you don't have to ask a shiur. If you're certain about something, you don't have to ask somebody for advice. You don't go looking for proof in things that you're certain about. Every day of your life, are you going to go and ask for proof that it's daytime? Proof that it's nighttime? The things you know for sure. Is it cold today? You're going to ask for proof? The weather forecast tells you that the temperature at the moment is 25 degrees. Are you going to ask for proof? They're things you know. Once if you know it, you don't have to ask for proof. However, when what you know, no matter how certain you are about it, impacts other people, your knowledge is insufficient. Your knowledge is sufficient for you. If you know something for sure, you don't have to ask a shiur, that's true. If you know something for sure, you don't have to go to Beis Din, that's true. If you know something for sure, you don't have to go and look for witnesses. That's because you know it. But if your knowledge impacts other people, we can't rely on your knowledge. Now we need real information. Now we need to be able to establish what the facts really are, and for that we need edus. And that's something that's important in our conversations with ourselves and our conversations with others, particularly at a time like this, when you get into this moral subjectivism that we've always had in the Western world, and now we're going to see it creeping in as things get more difficult and people start getting killed. We're going to get this. Is Israel within its rights to cut off water and electricity to Gaza? What about proportionality? And and everybody's got an opinion. And people are very sure about their opinion. They're very clear on what their opinion is. That's fine, you've got your opinion, that's for you. But you can't impose your opinion on other people to their disadvantage. For that, there's got to be halacha. For that, there's got to be you've got to start looking far more objectively. And thank God we've got a Torah. Otherwise, where do you start with this? Is it the right thing to do or isn't it the right thing? I have an opinion, it's wrong. I have an opinion, it's right. Who's right? Who's wrong? So there we have to come to halacha. That's where we get into halacha. Halacha is where your opinion isn't enough because your opinion can prejudice others. Your opinion is fine when the only person it can prejudice is you. Then your opinion is valid. But if your opinion can prejudice others, your opinion is irrelevant. What we need is a psak din, we need halacha, we need to know what the truth is. And in the conversations we will all be having over the next few months, it's an important idea to remember. Your opinion is irrelevant if your opinion prejudices other people. All that's relevant is what is the halacha, what is objectively right, what is ethically correct. And for that we've got to go to objective sources. This can no longer be a matter of personal opinion.